Welcome everyone to one of our last, if not the last, no, one of our last colloquium series talks. Oh, sorry, I see you just shared your screen. Okay. I just wanted to start with the land acknowledgement. First Nations peoples have lived on this part of Turtle Island for millennia, stewarding the land, the water, and all that contributes to life in this region. Today, the culture and presence of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples enrich the lands and people of this territory. More than 2 centuries ago, the Mississauga people welcomed settlers to this territory, providing sustenance and engaging in trade and commerce. Between 1781 and 1820, 8 treaties were signed between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who opened their territory to settlement. Today, York University's Keele campus is located on Toronto Purchase Treaty Number 13 lands and is situated on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. Treaty history is foundational, and it is our collective responsibility to honor the land as we honor and respect those who have gone before us, those who are here, and those who have yet to come. We are grateful for the opportunity to be learning, working, and thriving on this land, and we commit to learn the truth and be active in the process of reconciliation. I know that many of us are joining from many different places. Please take a moment to also acknowledge the land from which you are joining. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dr. Rebecca Murray is a lecturer in sociological studies at the University of Sheffield, UK, where she sits on her International Sanctuary Oversight Group and is a member of the National University of Sanctuary Steering Committee. Rebecca's extensive practice and research in relation to bordering and post-compulsory education has been developed in partnership with young migrant-led grassroots campaigning initiatives. Brantella Williams, who's the executive director of the S4 Collective, is a systems change advocate advancing equitable access to education with a focus on sanctuary students and precarious migrants. With a degree in political science from York University, she works at the intersection of policy, research, and community organizing to dismantle structural barriers to post-secondary education. It is a great pleasure to have you both here today.
Thank you. Awesome, so we'll get started. Thank you so much for the great introduction. So today we're here to talk about the sanctuary template, developing a shared vision of sanctuary and higher education across the UK and Canada. So just to show our partners or collaboration, we're in collaboration with the University of Sheffield, City of Sanctuary, both located in the UK, and in Canada, we have the S4 Collective, we have the York University and the Toronto Metropolitan University. We also want to shout out special thanks to Peter Mallon, Sarah Benini, and also Miriam Tehar, who are the project lead for this AWP project. So just to give a quick overview or a quick look into our agenda today, we're going to have an overview of what it is to be sanctuary, of what the sanctuary template even means, how did we produce a sanctuary template, and what process did we what does this mean, and why is it important to the current context. And also just introduce you to key terms that we will use throughout the presentation and also were used within the project. So for part 1, we'll talk about the bordering sanctuary key, and part 2, we'll talk about the program aim and objectives, the experts in the UK and Canada, who they are, the process that was used to carry out this project, the sanctuary template, campus map, and next steps. And part 3, we'll talk about the conceptual contributions, the research cycle, and the hope in crisis. Okay. So jump to quick overview. Great. So the key terms I mentioned earlier, we will actually see throughout this project, or is sanctuary seeker. This is adopted as an umbrella term to describe all precarious immigration statuses. For example, this includes individuals without recognized immigration status, asylum seekers, refugees, or any other label determined by state law. And higher education or tertiary education is also another word or term that you'll see throughout. And this is classified here as any post-compulsory education and the International Standard Classification of Education, ISCED. So the identified levels are the foundation or pre-sectional qualifications all the way up to doctorate. And then I'll pass it over to Rebecca.
Thank you. So I'd like to start following Brantella's introduction by just talking a little bit about why we need a sanctuary template. So to understand what preceded or how we arrived at the point of developing this piece of work over the course of the past 18 months. So really to do this, I want to talk about the relationship between bordering, sanctuaries of civil society response to bordering, and the kind of higher education border and how it relates to bordering practices in higher education. So increasingly, we can see the relationship between. So the thing about only been in the country about 24 hours. My brain's still my brain's not working its best at the moment. So bear with me, apologies. So thinking about bordering and thinking about initially how borders have really evolved, especially immigration borders, from kind of physical, kind of static borders often associated with being at the edge of a territory, to having developed into kind of much from physical barriers to much more symbolic and fluid sets of ideas which have the power to mold and adapt themselves to increasingly diverse situations in relation to migration movement, trajectories, and kind of perceived crises. And the malleability of border controls is particularly interesting in terms of their potential to be exported to kind of quite remote geographical locations. Think about the UK, particularly good at this in terms of how we use visa controls and export them to lots of different countries to prevent people, we impose the border far from our own physical territorial borders, to thinking about the very mundane aspects of bordering that take place in everyday life. And these are particularly important to understand because often they're so cleverly interwoven into life that we can fail to realise our own complicity in reproducing bordering practices and how we are responsible for reinforcing immigration controls. I would say that I'm also responsible for enforcing border controls in my own role as a university lecturer at Sheffield, given the very particular tight visa compliance regime we have at the institution. And I think the justification for bordering and kind of the increasing hostility around immigration borders is really compounded by xenophobia, the rise of populist politics and the far right, and the increasing scapegoating of migrants for many social problems. So to then apply this and think about one good way of understanding the malleability of bordering practices is thinking about how they've been extended to higher education in a myriad of different ways. And again, giving a very quick overview, but wanted to talk briefly about the higher education border, which is a term that I've adopted to use, and it's a singular term used to describe collective borders in higher education and their accumulative impact. So thinking about how when borders accumulate, we can see how they can compound the marginalisation experienced within higher education for people seeking sanctuary who want to pursue their studies. And if we make connections between these practices, instead of seeing instances like isolated and kind of one-off occurrence, such as not being able to access student funding, perhaps an admissions department reluctant to acknowledge or understand someone's prior qualifications or ability to speak the language of tuition, whether it's a partially activated student ID, or even being taught sensitive topics in a way that isn't trauma-informed. If we kind of step back from the disconnects and start to see how these practices are interconnected, it can demonstrate the strength of bordering and the power that they can have over people's experiences within higher education. So the higher education border is really a way of exploring the way that universities increasingly in different ways are accepting responsibility for securing immigration borders and thinking about how kind of very punitive bordering practices are actually become part of the everyday. And I think about kind of how we can categorize what these practices look like. They can, again, taking this from like Putin Van Neersen's work on bordering, thinking about borders that other, order, and border. So thinking about practices of othering, wherein before that really served to deter and discourage people from even applying to go to university, considering or thinking it will not be a space wherein they're welcome or their knowledge is valued or their skills are valued, thinking through to more more kind of implicit practices of ordering, which I gave a couple of examples of, like qualifications not being recognised or bureaucratic barriers that are seemingly impossible to overcome, through to more explicit forms of bordering where people might be outright excluded from an institution because of their immigration status or lack of recognised immigration status. And we can see within these kind of hierarchies of who doesn't belong in higher education, there are kind of very links to kind of colonial histories and the way we privilege different groups according to race, nationality and class. So, but alongside the idea about universities' role in excluding people, they're also quite contradictory because they're also significant endeavours by universities to widen access to groups. And for many universities, this extends to people who've sought sanctuary. That can be people who are resident in the country or perhaps overseas. But often these two contradictions sit alongside each other. And this is kind of really important because it's how Tanya Aberman and I came to work together. I think where there are strong similarities in respect to our roles as practitioners, or initially as activists in this space, and latterly academics. And I'm both still in academia. And I think the two key things in terms of our experience were about supporting migrant-led advocacy, which led for the Speaking Sanctuary initiatives, and secondly, how all the work we've undertaken to transform advocacy victories or successes into like a tangible reality of people in higher education. So making those distinct connections between the two is kind of like achieving the change and then actually implementing the change. When we first came together, when Tanya came to Sheffield on a fellowship, we explored sanctuary through the lens of higher education, a kind of conceptual reimagining. And broadly speaking, there are three key areas that we looked at in a paper that we worked on together. We presented some of it at the Centre for Refugee Studies previously. And this has kind of laid the foundations for moving on to the Access, Welcome, Protection project. Was thinking about how we define sanctuary, first of all, and given that there's a distinct lack of definition or kind of shared definition of sanctuary, it's conceptual kind of roots in the history of like sanctuary spaces of safety and protection in religious institutions or places of worship. And we sought to think about how that married with the contemporary context and how we could try to organise the diverse, disparate ways of understanding sanctuary. We position them on a spectrum and applied that spectrum to higher education to kind of see how it would practically work. There were four components to the sanctuary spectrum. The first was sanctuary practices that were an extension of border violence and the violence inherent in border violence. There was sanctuary as a practice kind of deserving, people who are deserving of sanctuary. There was sanctuary as a form of care, and also sanctuary as an act of solidarity. And within these reflections, we were thinking about whether they constituted like reformist or non-reformist reform. Were they initiatives that sought to ameliorate challenges within higher education structures, or were they seeking to try and transform those structures and create lasting kind of systemic change? We came to the idea of a nexus of access, welcome, and protection, these three key pillars for helping kind of give a framework for shaping further research, further inquiry, which led to developing the sanctuary template. And I'll hand over to Brantella to talk to you about how we started to operationalise some of that thinking.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Sorry, the slides are not moving. So
Is it moving on your computer?
yeah, it's on my computer. Yes.
Turn off your share and then reshare.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good idea.
It's the turn it off and turn it back on.
Okay.
Right at first.
Yeah, the trick works every time. Am I still in Zoom or should I boot it out?
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, did you get kicked out?
Yeah, I did.
I wonder if your connection's not strong enough.
Yeah, that's.
So maybe the thing to do would be to transfer your slides to, if you have a memory port, I have a memory key, and we can transfer it physically.
I was just getting yeah, great. Let me see. So, I'm just gonna pause.
And should be.
I'll start it over.
So as Rebecca mentioned before, the AWP project invites us to rethink what universities can and should be for individuals navigating displacement and precarious immigration status. Universities should be transcending the limitations of immigration status to imagine the university as a place of sanctuary. So this raises a fundamental question. How can a university truly function as a place of sanctuary? For many potential sanctuary seekers, especially those impacted by immigration, the university is not automatically a safe or accessible space. From previous research, we can understand that immigration status plays a major role in what one can access, particularly in the education system. This can mean limited access to funding, housing, healthcare, and overall access to resources that can limit the ability to participate fully in academic life. However, we also understand that this is just one layer of barrier, as barriers don't only exist outside of the higher education institutions. They also are internal, intrinsic barriers that can prevent a sanctuary scholar from achieving academic success. So this project will serve as a toolkit, if you will, to illustrate what sanctuary looks like when practiced in higher education institutions. So, who are the experts? And who is shaping this work? Earlier, you heard of the practice of conceptual thinking, of reimagining access, and later on in the process, we'll also discuss the methodology used to create EWP. However, this project was not built in isolation with experts in the academic fields. It was also shaped alongside the experts with lived experience. This project is a co-production of sanctuary students from both the UK and Canada, with expertise in displacement, joining their voices to advocate for a safer, supportive access while navigating higher education. The process. So, the methodology used is to examine how sanctuary is practiced between two different policies, two different education and immigration systems, and also the many nuanced student experiences. We gathered insights and lived realities of what higher education access looks like in the Canadian context versus the UK context. The AWP employed a participatory and trauma-informed approach with creative facilitation. Phase 1, focused on exploration and co-production. It consisted of bringing together the voices of 11 participants from the UK and 13 participants from Canada, together in a series of 10 meetings from a period of 18 months to build a sanctuary scholar template, or a sanctuary template key, I should say. For phase 2, the build-in phase consisted of the number of participants, which were now reduced, for 6 participants from Canada to 6 participants from the UK, who came together for 4 more sessions, give feedback, and finalize the creative products or creative outputs. For both phases, the meetings were held online via Zoom to ensure accessibility and flexible engagement across locations so that everyone can contribute meaningfully and were fairly compensated for their time and their expertise. The participants were in the majority undergraduate students in the age range from 20 to 30. We took everything we learned and began to refine the sanctuary template key into a sanctuary framework that institutions can adapt. We explored what is sanctuary and what it could potentially look like in practice. We discussed at great length the barriers and gaps in institutional support that sanctuary scholars face within higher education. At the same time, we began mapping these experiences both conceptually and visually, including early development of creative input, like the sanctuary template key, which I'm not able to show right now, and the campus map, which I also wish I could show right now, and the manifesto. Yes, great disservice right now, but that's okay. These outputs will help translate complex systems into more tangible actions. Okay, great. Hopefully. So one of the discussions that came up about when we talked about sanctuary and what it would look, some of the participants were able to use in animals and create an animal university. And the overarching topic that came out, which we made our overarching pillar, is protection. So protection have these different layers, which is protective status. no differentiation between sanctuary seekers and wider student population, changes in immigration status don't impact studies. Policy, there's two, internal university policies to include and account for the students, for the needs of sanctuary seekers, and also external policies that seek to ameliorate instead of exacerbate crisis that fuel placement. Number three, racism and xenophobia. Anti-racism is integral to the sanctuary template. It clearly defines and includes sanctuary seekers in policy and practice, and it should account for how prejudice on account of immigration status can compound issues relating to race and ethnicity. Number four, security. Wanting to feel safe on or in the proximity of university campuses. Number five, privacy. Sanctuary seekers can receive advice or guidance in a safe and secure space in full confidence that shared information remains confidential and anonymous, and also appropriately trained staff to respond to these unique circumstances, in addition to seeking consent to share unless safeguarding situation. The second overarching principle that we had was a community, and from there built the three pillars that are the foundation for the Access and Welcome Protect Progression project. So we have access. Physically, that's like your admissions office. Access refers to the ability of displaced learners to enter and participate in higher education without financial, administrative, legal, or structural obstacles. It means that a student's immigration status, fee category, or absence of documentation does not prevent them from enrolling, receiving accurate guidance, or being recognized as a legitimate applicant. Number two, welcome. This can mean all the spaces that you could go to, your library, the things that are at your school, the types of food that are at your school. That includes enrollment, belonging, and graduation. Welcome refers to the creation of environments, physical, social, and relational, where displaced learners feel safe, recognized, and generally included. It means fostering spaces and communities that support dignity, belonging, and emotional security without replicating institutional barriers of hierarchies. Progression, this happens like what happens after graduation. If we even get to graduation, how do you progress throughout university? And are students able to move on to their masters and doctorates if they so wish? So beyond graduation paths or graduate pathways, progress into master's or doctorate programs. So protection ensures displaced learners can study in an environment that safeguards their safety, dignity, and rights. It guarantees confidentiality of personal and immigration information, provides safe spaces free from surveillance, and secures fair treatment without discrimination. Institutional policies actively reduce risk, and universities advocate visibly for sanctuary learners, taking an intersectional approach to anti-racism and fostering a culture of trust, security, and solidarity. The template key initially focused on the different characters navigating their journey, aligned with the pillars and the various barriers they encounter while pursuing their education. This is also in the slide, so I'll just mention them really quickly. The four characters that we came up to will be navigating these university spaces, which will be in our map, is the Pathfinder, the Bridge Builder, the Climber, and the Dream Chaser. Jump to our next steps. Our next steps are focused on building and deepening this work. We're confirming and have confirmed partners from various higher education institutions across the UK and Canada, onboarding contributors and finalizing the structure of our co-production process. We're beginning outreach and participating in various sessions like the one today to discuss the necessity of the project and finalizing the development of the creative output to to share a resource for higher education institutions. And I'll pass it back on to Rebecca.
Okay, so just to say that it would be really nice to be able to share the template, and the template's defined, as Brantella said, with this the compass, which is designed to guide people across a campus map. And by accessing the map, there is a key that supports people to understand. There's like the written vision of what different elements look like, or what the vision of what sanctuary would look like if access were no longer a problem, or progression was no longer a problem. So perhaps we can get permission to share when it's finalised. Maybe people who are here today can receive a copy or get access to it. So the template took 18 months to produce. it was a careful and detailed endeavour, and key to that was creating the time and space to evolve and grow the information which is being distilled into the template itself. And what we're kind of thinking about now, we're exploring the idea that this kind of was grounded in originally in praxis, and we went to kind of, Tanya and I both had our respective research, which we brought together, then we undertook the template, and now we're thinking about some of the early reflections and conceptual thinking about the template. And there are two areas that we're thinking about, which are about how the template supports our understanding, or it's a tool for thinking about the relationship between research and practice more kind of comprehensively. And secondly, how the sanctuary template, its relationship to hope in what for many people are seeing as an increasing context of despair. How can we find hope? Where can we find hope? So I recently attended a research seminar, which was brilliant, and I'm not going to give too many details because I don't want to. One of my main takeaways from that seminar was that the academic had done some brilliant, insightful research, which had real implications for humanitarian responses to people in displacement camps, in refugee camps. But when asked questions about plans for the findings, what they would do with them, they were worried or concerned that to try and share them with those aid agencies, they would be subsumed by the process, and they were concerned about the reality of being able to overcome the structures of power at play that were producing these harms in the first place. Where could they actually go? What could they do with those findings? And I think this is really important because it speaks to a really kind of critical tension between critical thinking and action. And it's something that I think I've battled with and trying to kind of bridge, kind of navigate that. It's a difficult position as an academic in terms of achieving change, but also engaging in critical thinking. And how do we balance out issues that require an urgent response, but then taking the time to think more deeply and critically about issues and how we can best respond. And I think as academics, we kind of need to reconcile ourselves with being imperfect, or things kind of being good enough, or are these steps towards change, or what the kind of how can we move in the right direction whilst accepting that when we act, it generally is imperfect. And this is important in terms of thinking about the bridges that we can hopefully build between research, conceptual thinking, and practice. So, in terms of hope, hope is a word I keep hearing on repeat at the moment. I think people are despairing to the extent of the current politics that hope is something that people are holding on to more and more. And I think producing the template, it was evident that hope and joy are a really important antidote to the ambivalence and violence that can characterise immigration regimes, and from the structural to the kind of very interpersonal level. And I think hope and despair, or hope and crisis, aren't kind of polar opposites, but they're kind of issues concepts that co-constitute each other. And actually overlap and enmesh. It's hard to talk about one without the other. Next slide. Thank you. So I think the politics of hope is increasing, and I think it's partly a response to the increasingly kind of bleak political landscape. What?
Is it the next one?
There's this one. It's this one. Right. Yes.
This is the hope part.
Okay, we're moving on to talk about hope. And I say that there are glimmers of hope. Well, I should say before we get to the glimmers of hope, I think it's important to acknowledge the bleak political landscape, and I think I'm aware that and how they connect the relationship between immigration and higher education. I'm aware, I'm not an expert by any means on the Canadian context, but of the new immigration bill and C12 and the new restrictions on people being able to seek asylum, how long after they've entered the country. And the implications that has for people on visas, including student visas, the idea that sometimes people's return is blocked, situations change, and then there's a need to seek asylum after considerable periods of time in a country. In the UK, the UK have it down to it. They are the increasing denigration of asylum rights and clandestine entry. Being able to legally claim asylum when you've entered clandestine is incredibly difficult. And increasingly, it's incredibly difficult to have a safe and legal route into the UK. And a response recently to an increase in student visas from countries like Myanmar, Sudan, and Afghanistan was to ban student visas from those countries altogether. A recent break on visas from those countries. I mean, I'm just touching on some of the difficulties, but it is, and in the UK higher education sector relies heavily on international students. This is having a huge impact financially, practically, in a sector that is, you know, struggling already. So it's increasingly, we can see that, you know, immigration is increasingly presented as a pressing social problem. And I think students in higher education who are international, if they're classed as such according to their immigration status, are very visible, and it's easy to kind of clamp down or kind of impose restrictions. Would argue, I think in the UK, people are doubly surveilled. We have very strong surveillance of people on student visas. People are surveilled by the Home Office around their asylum claim, and they're surveilled again in higher education. However, yeah, the glimmers of hope. I think politically people are excited by Zoran Mandami, the new mayor of New York, in terms of his strong socialist principles and offering kind of a difficult political alternative. This lady here, probably less familiar to a Canadian audience, that's Hannah Spencer. She just recently was elected to a constituency next to my own in Greater Manchester, and she beat what was considered to be the most powerful kind of like potential reforms greatest hope in terms of Nigel Farage and his party. She managed to beat him. It was a very difficult contest. And she again is a beacon of hope in my immediate locality, and I'd say for the Greens in the UK. I think as well a powerful response of sanctuary cities in terms of ICE in America is another source of hope. However, the reason for highlighting this is that, you know, hope had a really important role in the sanctuary template. And I wanted to just read you a brief poem. This is by a colleague of mine, and he wrote, I'm going to read you a very brief excerpt from his poem. It was a much longer piece that he wrote, but I speak of hope to remember where I come from. I speak of hope to imagine where we together might go. I speak of hope because it crossed borders with me, from Herat through Kabul and into the UK, tucked in my chest like breath, holding my family together when all else was uncertain. And I think when Mir talks about hope, and there are other academics that articulate this really well, and it also resonates with my experience in terms of my research, but also as a practitioner, is that hope sometimes is the only piece of luggage or baggage people bring with them, or that they hold on to the tightest when they seek asylum or rebuild lives in displacement. And there is a responsibility, and I've seen the benefit of doing this, or what it can do in responding to this hope by building on it in advocacy and activist spaces, and kind of taking that hope seriously and working with it. And it was important in terms of the template, I'd say broadly for two reasons. One, well, first of all, when we looked at knowledge production, we talked a lot about how we produce knowledge, who gets to produce it, whose knowledge is valued. And we looked at the work of Foucault about analysis of power. We looked at Bell Hook's work about working within the margins and the power of people coming together often through struggle, but the joy that can bring and how that can connect people and what the potential is to speak back to power from the margins. So when it came to looking at knowledge production and having those kind of conversations, it wasn't always so much that we were wanting to, I'd say, learn about lived experience, but learning from it. So people didn't have to give their personal stories or testimonies. It was about the kind of broader experiences of their thinking about how that knowledge could be applied. And there are two kind of important for two reasons. In terms of, well, I'd say first was that it was to, I'd say, to kind of understand the value of exchanging knowledge across the two different contexts, kind of within and between the two different contexts. We're doing all this online. And secondly, to inspire hope in the value and power of knowledge held by group members. And we had a knowledge manifesto, which is essentially a social contract to agree that we would stay true to that knowledge that was produced, and that would be distilled to the best and how such a huge amount of knowledge and information will be distilled and stay as true as possible to those original conversations, those discussions. So just briefly to talk about the relationship between crisis and utopia, and essentially why should we care? Why should we hope? Began with a couple of examples of kind of recent political hope, but there's also a lot of talk about hope and possibilities within critical inquiry. And drawing quite heavily on the work of Sarah Amsler, she articulates really clearly why people often don't feel hopeful, that it can seem pointless, in overwhelming kind of global economic, political, kind of social ruptures that are occurring and the multiple crises. And the idea of right-wing populist politics building momentums of kind of crisis of fear, and that people can feel powerless to leverage any kind of change and think that their thinking can be very present-centered and see the future as fixed and unchangeable. When there's a different perspective that people currently kind of, there's a role of recognizing people to recognize their own agency and role in orientating towards a different future, albeit one that is unknown. And also when it comes to thinking about utopias or having visions that don't really resonate with the wider context or seem a bit out of kilter, it's important to think that, you know, they can be seen as naive, fanciful, amateurish, and at worst seem to impede progress. Well, that's expecting too much. That's too hopeful. That's too optimistic. We need to kind of tamper down people's dreams and ambition in some circumstances. So when it comes to thinking about hope, without kind of, we're doing this very briefly, but there are two kind of, I think, looking at Ernst Bloch's work, and most roads, when you look at hope, lead back to him, or they begin with him, the foundations of his work. And he talks about or defined hope as an objective human characteristic. And the idea about looking for the power of hope in social transformations, in looking for, like in the politics of small things and kind of everyday practices, which can be really, they operate from what's seemingly very mundane. The idea that we're all hopeful. I was very hopeful setting an alarm clock this morning, and the jet lag would not have me wake up at 2 a.m. But you know, I'm still hopeful and optimistic that most people will get up in the morning, that there will be another day. To the hope that's held on to an incredible adversity, thinking about Murray and his journey to the UK. So the Sanctuary Temple could be seen as a beacon of hope. It could be seen as a kind of our version of our utopia of higher education, what it could be like, an antithesis to the crisis discourse, that there is an alternative way of imagining the future. And we say this, you know, that for the template to work, it's about working collectively in solidarity. We recognise that higher education is kind of less kind of critical thinking, perhaps more kind of consumerist or neoliberal and marketized. There are different ways of looking at it. We recognise that contradiction, but still believe it's possible to work towards implementation and taking this forward. I won't talk about the diversity of how utopia is conceptualized, but it is, I acknowledge that it's vast. And just to come back to conclude, to say that, you know, I started with an academic who was not very hopeful for their findings having any impact, but I speak for, I hope that all the project partners and anyone that contributed to the template, that we are hopeful of what we can achieve with the template. It's either a tool for universities who are already engaged in Sanctuary to do more or expand or change their practices, or it's a blueprint to inspire universities, not to impose an idea, but inspire ways that Sanctuary can work. And just to end to say that we hope, however the template is used, it's always in collaboration with people with histories or current experience of displacement. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Were there any slides you wanted to show us that we didn't get a chance to get through?
Sure, I think there are so many. I think the most, the map, yeah. So just to show quickly, you know, how the idea is for the students, there are different universities that they created with AI for their annual universities. And we just wanted to script for the Sanctuary template key, how all the ideas came together. And also the most important part is the map. So I won't put anyone on the spot. We have some great artists here who help to create this template that shows the different access points in universities, but also the different barriers that exist in these different spaces. And this will be the template, the map, the actual what would I call it?
This is the map, but then by clicking on different, it'd be interactive.
Yes.
So you click on different aspects, and it's gone back to working with some creators who have gone back to them recently to kind of finesse this. But you'll click on different sections and you'll be able to access the section on, say you're interested in the progression pathways. There are 4 progression pathways we talk about in the map. They are an academic pathway, a volunteering pathway, an employment pathway, and a vocational pathway. It's hard to delineate, it's hard to split them into categories, but you'll be able to see advice and kind of what that pathway would look like or could look like. Mm-hmm. And so And again, the key has been the hardest thing to write. But we have supporting documents within the key of like inspirational kind of bits of work, or kind of there's some poems, there's some beautiful stuff that was created in the process of making the template you can have access to. Also documents, policies, examples of other practices elsewhere. We're trying to make them as diverse as possible, but to kind of give people the tools to implement the template, to kind of translate it. And the idea is that it can be adapted and translated across different country contexts, institutional contexts. We want it to be, what we really want to do is also learn. It's a framework for having conversations about what sanctuary looks like in different places, and to be able to use it, better understand and connect that understanding across different places.
Thanks for that. And so basically, they'll be able to choose the different characters at the bottom of the Pathfinder to which we're going to climber and Dream Tracer to actually navigate the spaces and see exactly what they can do. So there will be interactive spots where they will show or have descriptions of each of the spaces, the barriers, and how to really improve on the access for sanctuary students. Awesome. I think those are the most important ones, and I will stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much.